What books would you recommend for someone who wants to become more familiar with Greek Orthodoxy?
The classic text is one written by a layman named Timothy Ware, first published in 1963. It's called The Orthodox Church. He later became an Orthodox monk with the name Callistus, and now for many years he has been both a bishop in the Orthodox Church and a professor at Oxford University, and he retired just recently, but he still lives at Oxford and still has a ministry there. The book is so brief and at the same time masterful that it has been translated into Greek and is used in the Greek Orthodox Church, but it is, I think it's never been surpassed. Other people like other books better, but that is my favorite.
Okay, next. What year was this icon set on the book?
There is discussion about icons. They are not dated, they're not signed. It's by making very, very careful comparisons with others that where you know something about them that you can say, we attribute this to this century, that century. So it's still under discussion, but it's thought to date from the late 12th century.
From the 9th to the 12th?
Late 12th century.
So the late 1100s.
The polished halos that you see in the polished gold, that is a trademark of the Sinai icons.
Does St. Catherine's tell a different story about the discovery of Codex Sinaiticus than the one usually told about Tischendorf?
We have just finished a collaboration with the other three institutions that hold these in fragments of the Codex Sinaiticus, and the Archbishop could have said, the history of the text is so controversial, let's stay completely away from it and only concentrate on the text as a scholarly work. But instead he took the opposite approach. He said we all have to face up to the recent history of this text, so if we are going to be a part of this collaboration, it must include a complete investigation into the recent history. And by recent history he meant 1844, when Tischendorf first visited Sinai, he took 43 leaves with him, which he gave to the University of Leipzig, up to 1933, when the leaves that had been in Russia were sold to England. Everyone knows the story that Constantine Tischendorf rescued this when it was on the verge of being burned, but I think that increasingly scholars are discounting this story. It was not something that Tischendorf wrote in the letters that he wrote to his wife at the time. It was something that he wrote many, many years later, trying to justify his taking of the leaves. It is clear that parchment is leather and it doesn't burn, and Tischendorf never said that himself. He quoted someone else as saying it, so he was like sliding around and evading and trying to find a justification for taking these leaves. The collaboration has now revealed many, many documents that were sealed in archives that were off limits to scholars until this collaboration. We know now that Tischendorf had relatively little to do with the final outcome. The manuscript was published in 1862. It was the oldest known Bible at the time. It was sensational. So there were some within Russia who said, now we're obligated to give it back. It doesn't belong to us. But there were others in Russia who said, this is our opportunity to have the world's oldest Bible. Let's see what we can do to get it. And it was at a difficult time for the monastery. We know now that there were letters written by the Russian ambassadors saying, we will not recognize a new archbishop, we will not give you back the money that we have impounded here in Russia until you sign over the codex. So all of these documents have now been made accessible and will be published next year by the British Library. The more you read about the history, the more complicated it all becomes. And scholars have said this is the case that lawyers love, because by the time it's settled, many, many cases will have been heard. It becomes bewilderingly complicated. I think you can say that the legal aspects are still extremely complicated, but the monastery has a moral case that it was taken under duress.
There are a lot of people who are very interested in Greek Orthodoxy in a couple of different perspectives. So at the risk of being intrusive but knowing your gentle heart, does your beard and head covering signify anything?
In the West, the tonsure was what you see in the photographs of Francis of Assisi, where they would shave their head and leave a little halo of hair around it. We know in the Old Testament that Samson was told not to cut his hair or his beard because he was consecrated to God. And that is why he did not cut his hair or his beard. And that is a tradition that is kept in the Orthodox Church, that monastics are consecrated to God, and so their hair is cut in the ceremony of tonsure, and then it's not cut afterwards. And the length of a beard has nothing to do with how long you've had a beard. Some people have had a beard for many years and it's relatively short, others it's more long.
Okay, could you briefly tell us a little bit about your journey from growing up in a evangelical household and moving into Greek Orthodoxy?
Well, just very briefly, because I would rather concentrate on the manuscripts of Sinai. I grew up knowing a great deal about the New Testament and a great deal about the Reformation, more recent history of the church, but not anything that happened in between. And it was curiosity that led me to read first medieval history and later Byzantine history. And after I had read many texts on Byzantine history, I began to be concentrated more on the history of the church. And only after I had read many books on the church history that I began to attend Orthodox services. And I remember how bewildering, confusing the services were because I had no understanding of the structure of the services. But then I was determined to connect what I was seeing with what I had already read, and the more I understood, the more I felt that I'd come to a great treasure. So I became Orthodox as a student in university, and then it was a much smaller step to enter a monastery where the church becomes your whole life.
Okay, a couple of questions, if we could, about St. Catherine's Monastery. I think people have an interest in the burning bush. One question was, could you expand on how the burning bush and Mary were seen to be related in a sense, or the burning bush a type for Mary?
St. Macarius, who lived in the 5th century, has written a very, very beautiful homily on the burning bush. He said that the bush burned with fire, but the bush was not consumed by the fire. This was the same fire that wafted the prophet Elijah to heaven in the chariot of fire. It was the same fire that descended upon the holy apostles as flames of fire in the day of Pentecost. And it was of this fire that Christ spoke when he says, "I have come to send fire upon the earth, and what would I if it be already kindled?" The fact that the fact that God spoke to Moses through the bush is seen as an anticipation of the incarnation, when God takes upon himself our human nature. The fact that the bush burned without being consumed by the flames, and that through the burning bush God spoke to Moses, has been seen as a parallel of the incarnation and the place of the Virgin Mary in the incarnation. There are many, many hymns in the Orthodox Church that draw this parallel. It is not something you find in the West until the time of the Crusades, and that was when the Christians in the West came in contact with this, and then you do see it in the West. In the Chartres Cathedral in France, there's a carving of the Virgin Mary standing on the burning bush, and in the Canterbury Tales, the prioress mentions the burning bush as the type of the Virgin Mary. So these are parallels that enter into the West at the time of the Crusades.
Scholastically, we were taught that Codex Sinaiticus is not just the oldest surviving full Bible, but that it's the actual Greek text, by and large, that's used as the baseline for the Greek versions, or for the Greek's New Testaments that we buy today, that scholars use to translate out of. From your perspective, as someone who's the librarian at this monastery which kept this treasure, do you have any insight into how reliable it is as a text? One question. As to how old it is and how it came to be at the monastery, and whether or not it might have been one of the 50 copies of Scripture that were requisitioned by Constantine.
Okay, the easy answer is that we know it was written between 325 and 350, and scholars tend to date things late in out of a sense of safety. So we can be more ambitious and say, let's say 325. But that means that it was written just after the end of the persecution of the Christians. It was the Emperor Constantine who put an end to the persecution of the Christians. The first scriptures were written in hiding by people who were not professional scribes. They were written sometimes at peril of death. One of the first things the Romans would do was to confiscate copies of the scriptures and to destroy them. And the earliest surviving copies of the scriptures are written on papyrus. which was the common writing material of the day, but it's not something that survives in a Mediterranean climate. That's why the earliest copies of the scriptures are written on papyrus, and they survive in the sands of Egypt, and they were recovered by archaeologists mostly in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The Codex Sinaiticus is the world's oldest Bible written on parchment. It is the world's oldest complete New Testament, and scholars feel that it preserves a very pure strand of the text, and so they will always want to know what does the Codex Sinaiticus say when they're studying the history of the Septuagint, which is the Old Testament translated into Greek, and the New Testament, which was of course composed in Greek. So it's extremely important for scholars, and it's a wonderful thing that the text has now been made accessible online with detailed photographs and a completely new transcription, which is the most expensive part of this recent collaboration. And in just a few weeks, the facsimile will be available. It's being printed in China, and the first copy was bound by hand and sent by Federal Express to London just last week when we had a meeting there, and we were able to see it and make a formal presentation of the first hand-bound copy of the facsimile. So it would be a very important opportunity for people to be able to read it for themselves. Many times they will see readings of the Codex Sinaiticus, what it says. Here they have an opportunity to open a beautifully printed facsimile and read these passages for themselves. We know that the Emperor Constantine ordered 50 copies of the scriptures from Eusebius, who was a bishop of Caesarea. We know that he had an important library in Caesarea, many manuscripts brought from Alexandria, where there was a whole tradition of copying manuscripts carefully. If you saw something that was wrong, you didn't correct it, you copied it out exactly as it was written. And that's why the Eusebius was asked to make these copies of the scriptures. We don't know exactly if any of these copies survive. We don't even know, were they New Testaments, Old Testaments, lectionaries? What does he mean by 50 copies of the scriptures? Could it have been several types? But we know that the Codex Sinaiticus would have been an expensive volume to produce, and it could well be one of those 50 copies. So it remains a tantalizing thought. We can't say more than that. As to the reliability of the text, scholars feel that it is an early text that preserves a very pure stream of the text, and it must be taken into account by anyone studying the history of the text. But I would like to say that when you read works of textual criticism, they are dwelling on the passages that differ and on the passages where there might be reasons for those differences, and you lose sight of the fact that for the greater part of the scriptures there are no differences. And it is important to remember that the readings do not change the theology. The theology comes through in any manuscript, and the Orthodox have always said the gospel is behind the gospels. It is the message and the meaning and the significance. So that is what comes through in all of the manuscripts, and that is what is the greatest significance.
Wonderful. Thank you very, very much.